Welcome to Overactive Mind Podcast, OAM. I have my guest Mazy here, who has been a longtime friend, actually one of my very first virtual friends ever, and then moved to Texas where I am and became now a real friend out of virtual reality into real reality. Um, and then had a awakening here in Texas and went back to where her home is after she has transformed herself from a wonderful story, which I'm excited to share with you guys today. She was transgender and then detransitioned, but this is not a normal detransition story because we're talking about years and years, like almost what, 16 years? How long was it?
If you include my transition, 14 years.
So 14 years of being Jack, uh, right? And
Yeah.
that's not a small thing. And for that to detransition after 14 years, some radical insights that she shared with me that I'm like, man, I got to share this with the whole world because this is something that everyone, I mean, if you're on that path, if you're even in that, whether you're political about it or not political about it, it's a very polarizing topic. But you know what? Let's hear it from someone who's walked the path and is in currently in that stage of, hey, I've seen both sides of the coin. I've seen the transition, the detransition. I've walked the line. So, yeah, welcome, Maisie. Tell me, how did this start for you? How did you become Jack? And
Well, if we're going to back to the beginning, I pretty much perceive myself as a boy from my earliest memories. So I
okay,
never really had a comparison until I detransitioned. And
mm,
um, it my childhood was somewhat surreal at times because it took me quite a few years to even realize that I was being raised as a girl. So like I didn't understand that. Nobody really explained it to me. Like
right.
um it it was just this conflict mostly between me and my mom and adults around me
Mhm.
and nobody actually explained it bluntly that hey, you're a girl and well, why do you think you're a boy? Nobody talked about it. So it was kind of like being in the Matrix. And then I remember having a realization when I was about 8 years old. Oh my God, not only are they trying to force me to be a girl, they actually believe I am one.
At 8?
Yeah, and so like I couldn't wrap my head around it. So there was that aspect of it that was very maybe social, but then I also had something happening with my body where I just felt really horrified, honestly. Like something was wrong. Something innately is wrong from a very young age, from like pretty much my earliest memories when I was like 3, 4 years old. And nobody was really helping me with that. That was ignored. So I learned at a very early age that I would have to take care of myself, basically. And so I became a very highly independent person. And all of that together kind of molded my personality. I became very independent. I became a seeker. I was searching for truth really on my own. And I felt like I was in a world where things didn't really make sense, that adults
Yeah.
were kind of ignoring what was happening to me. And I had to figure it out myself.
So yeah, at an early age, no one was there to support you. It sounds like you were confused. You had this thing happen like at age 3, 4, you were aware something's innately wrong in my body or in my something's wrong. And when you go to explain this to other adults, they're not hearing you, they're not listening to you, they don't acknowledge you. And so you had to do this self-reliance thing pretty freaking early, it sounds like. Sounds really hard. From the self-reliance part, age 8 is when you kind of took that on the most, or I mean, maybe I'm going the wrong direction here, but
No, well, 8 is when I had the realization that people actually thought I was a girl. And
right,
so I
right, right,
started to
right.
get really angry. Um, from about ages 9 to 12, I was like really angry at my parents. I had multiple realizations between 12 and 14. There was one time when I was 12 and the teacher was yelling at us and she was lying about us. There was some really weird stuff that happened when I was a kid with adults. But there was this teacher that was straight up lying about us while she was yelling at us and like trying to basically make paint us as criminals almost. And I had this voice in my head say, in the middle of her saying this, it was almost like time stopped. And I heard this voice, and you would call this the inner voice. So I've learned to recognize these things retroactively.
Yeah.
And there's this movie, Labyrinth, from the 80s, where this girl gets lost in a maze in this fantastical world. And there's this magical being, like this wizard guy, the Goblin King, that like manipulates her and controls everything because he's magical. But at the end of the film, she says to him, she has a realization, like she can't win against anything he's saying or any of his games. And then suddenly she says to him, "You have no power over me." And all of his magic vanishes and he can't do anything. So like
Mhm.
it looks like he's winning because he's always playing games, but he never stopped her from overcoming those barriers. And when I was 12 and there's this teacher yelling at us, that voice spoke in my head. The inner voice said, "She's only doing this because she has no power over you." And so like there are moments like that basically throughout my childhood.
Do you feel like most of your wisdom has come from within?
My wisdom has come from a variety of sources actually.
Of course, of course.
Pieces and parts, and it's just like the recipe just kind of came together miraculously. And I'm sure a lot of it, I would say, comes from God,
Yeah.
whether I knew it or not.
Let's
Um,
talk a little bit about that actually. It's fascinating. Because you would have never have used the word God like you just did a year ago, I feel like. Maybe more. But at age 12, 13, 14, when you're trying to figure this out, what was your relationship with God like? Like, was there a relationship or what that look like?
I grew up non-religious, and it was really an odd experience because the culture immediately around me was mostly non-religious, and like to the point that we didn't even really have a lot of atheists. Like people didn't see a reason to be an atheist because it wasn't like a topic that was really conscious around us. But my mom was Christian, and so that was an interesting juxtaposition because like it was right in my family because she was there, but like she was very private about it and it was very personal and vulnerable and intimate for her. So I was never really exposed to any kind of spirituality. I would say that I have retroactively realized that there was some really remarkably mysterious, like spiritual, inexplainable experiences happening to me throughout my life. And I interpret them and like recognize them spiritually now. But I became spiritual more consciously gradually throughout my 20s. When I was about 12 to 14 is when those types of events were happening that I'm like looking back, I'm like, wow, that's a pretty wild set of things to happen. Like there's no explanation for it because like why would a voice in my head say this teacher that's being abusive to us has no power over me? Where would that come from if it's in the ordinary world? And I have no real exposure to the idea of youth rights and healthy boundaries and, mutual respect. If I was basically around adults that were very destructive and authoritarian in my life, where would that voice come from? And,
Yeah.
anytime that voice is spoken to me too, it feels like almost multi-dimensional, like it has a power to it. It has like a command and
Story.
like intimidation and also love, and like it's not trying to be intimidating, but it's just like right then and there. Your original question was like what was my spirituality and what was my relationship to God? And I would say that it was invisible and it wasn't conscious to me. When I was 13, I saw the movie Into the Wild,
Okay.
and it's about the true story of Christopher McCandless. And after he graduated college, kind of grew up, you could stereotypically say, in the American dream, like in a suburban family,
Right,
nice
right.
house, reasonably stable, went to college, graduated, was set up for success by traditional terms, and he left it all behind. And he was very restless, and he was a seeker. And he was reading books by like Thoreau and
Yeah.
some of the great writers on the wilderness and nature. I can't think of all their names at the moment, but he wanted to like get deep in nature and like he was really drawn to it. And he went, hitchhiking across all of America and even into Mexico illegally and found his way back into America. And it was just this wild adventure. And I saw it when I was 13, and it was profound. Like, it was a glimpse into a different world for me because I felt like my whole world was very small and was very controlled, and I had no power over my own life. And all of a sudden, I see this, and I felt like somebody was actually acknowledging this deep human desire for liberation, autonomy, the hero's journey.
Mm,
And then the last big thing was when I was 14, the inner voice spoke to me again, and this was like it's just a very critical moment in my life. I don't even know how to describe it, but it just came to me like casually all of a sudden, bam, it's there as present in the middle of nowhere. And it said to me, if you don't do something about this, is going to kill you. And somehow, whenever this voice is speaking, it feels like in few words it has so much more meaning to it. And
uh,
I somehow instinctively knew that it was like referencing what I was suffering, like my this unknown horrible health condition. And like it was
okay.
all entangled with the fact that people were treating me as a girl and I felt like a boy. And
Okay.
by the time I was about 13, 14, I had physical pain that was horrible. It was so bad. I mentally could not comprehend all the pain at once. It was impossible. So like my hands would get tingly, my face would get tingly, I would get very weak and tired. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this voice says that to me. I somehow instinctively interpreted it as an acknowledgement of I didn't have the name transgenderism yet,
Okay.
but there was like the fact that I was having all this pain. So there's the physical aspect of it,
Right.
but then there's also like this weird situation where I'm being treated as a girl and I feel like a boy. And as part of that, a lot of the natural parts of how I am are being basically rejected. So my mom was rejecting this stuff, and I became very rebellious. And I became this like viscerally authentic person in rebellion because all of that was being rejected. And so it's this like collection of things that were all kind of entangled into one
But
ball that
you called it,
um,
sorry, I'm gonna cut you off. So when you say this, you're talking about you didn't have the word transgender yet. I know you gave me the term intersex. Is that what you meant? Like if
Mhm.
there's some sort of disorder, something wrong with me, there's no name for it, but yet somehow you knew exactly what it meant when it said this.
So when that voice said that, it felt like it was the first time anybody acknowledged that something was wrong with me, that it
Mm,
had been being denied
mm,
for a very long time throughout my childhood. So it's really felt like I grew up in the Matrix when you don't have the words for it, and it's like it's consumed this set of denial and lies has consumed your entire environment. It really is like the Matrix. So
mm,
everything around me, it's like there was this outside world that had developed, and then that was contradicting and clashing with everything developing internally with me. So I have realized over time, again and again, just how much I developed as a person, almost um, in isolation or in contrast to the things around me. So I became kind of an odd person, a
yeah,
very distinct person.
because you're so self-reliant, so independent. You had your own way of thinking, your own way of everything, because no one really acknowledged you, and no one. I mean, you had friends though. You had friends in high school and middle school, right?
Yeah, I definitely like I had, school was basically the only place I went that allowed me to get away from my family. So like my world was very small and it was pretty tightly controlled. And school was the place where I could go see my friends and be away from all of that at home. And I was extremely social. So when people say isolation, they kind of take it to an absolute, but I think it's much subtler than that. I felt like my childhood was pretty tightly controlled and it was quite limited on what I was able to do and where I was able to go. And I didn't really get a lot of exposure to what I would call the real world. And
Mm,
that's kind of an epidemic these days. I eventually became a youth mentor and got into youth empowerment work. And there's a lot of young people in the last 40 years that are very tightly controlled in a very small world. and don't get a chance to go out in the real world and actually like have their hero's journey and actually become empowered and become capable. And, eventually in early adulthood, they're kind of just thrown out into the world without any skills or any connections, and they're basically set up for poverty.
Right. When
Um,
did you embrace that full independence and said, I am Jack and this is who I am, this is who I'm going to be, and I'm going to start, like, when did that happen for you?
well, after the inner voice spoke to me, so like I'd had that experience when I was 12 with that teacher, and that really was pivotal in me trying to claim my independence from adults because the only relationships I had with adults was adversarial. And I was always in self-defense with them. So like I was really putting a stake in the ground saying, I'm claiming my independence and standing
Right.
up for my human rights. And then when 13, I see the movie Into the Wild, and then I become insatiably obsessed with a greater picture of my liberation of like, I want to be independent from this tiny little world I'm trapped in. And by 14, when I hear the inner voice, that's when I said, I'm going to figure out what's wrong with me. I'm going to figure out what's going on with my health on my
Right.
own, and I'm going to go find doctors. So I started doing research at the library, and I found the book As Nature Made Him the Boy Who Was Raised a Girl. That was about a true story of this guy, David Reimer, in the 1970s. So he was a twin and he had a botched circumcision, and the doctors tried something highly experimental where they decided to tell his parents to raise him as a girl. And so it was really this experiment because here's this twin that they're going to raise as a boy, and then him they're going to raise as a girl. And they really just made these kids guinea pigs. And it was this absolute disaster. And his natural disposition, his natural personality and instincts came through. And then by the time he was about 13, his parents finally told him the truth. So, like, I read that book and I was just astounded. And for maybe this is a bit odd, but I viscerally related to his story. Like I felt a automatic parallel that was very clear and very obvious, and it was the first time I found anything that I felt like referenced my experience.
I acknowledge your experience.
Even though he was biologically male and I would have been transgender, I still found that connection. And then I also, at that same time, found the movie called Boys Don't Cry, that was based on a true story of Brandon Tina in the 90s, I think. He was a trans man, so female to male transgender like I was. I just saw his story where he basically um, was kind of a vagabond, kind of traveling, running away, trying to establish a life, and just lived as a man. And he went with what was called stealth, where you don't tell people you're trans and you try to just blend in. But he just wanted to be a regular man, and that's what I felt like. I didn't want to go around announcing I was trans. So like I saw those two things, those stories. That was when I determined, okay, transgender, that's a label, that's a definition. I finally have something that explains how
Acknowledge.
I could be a man, even though I have a physical condition where people think I'm a girl.
This is so fascinating because you're using language that is independent from the transgender language. You're saying things like, I had this condition. I don't know what it was, right? It's a real thing. I was suffering. I had physical suffering. Even today, you're like, would you definitely say it was 100% transgender? Like, what is transgender? Like, what the hell? What is it?
I'm glad you asked that question because like I feel like people in the drama of the culture war around this are grasping at straws, and everyone wants to find a definition. That's what everyone has in common. They want to know what it is so that they can respond accordingly. Like, do we need to respond medically, mental health wise? How do we treat people? That is one of the central things going on here. And um, so when I was transgender and at around 14 going forward, I gradually developed this like perception that was a man with a rare disorder. That's the simplest way to put it. And I started to think, well, maybe it's an intersex disorder because I'm clearly a man, but I have a physical body that does not completely line up with that. And so if you're not clearly male or female, the only other option is that you have some kind of intersex condition. So that was
Okay.
how I perceived it at the time. But when I detransitioned, it's like I had this whole working theory that was like a house of cards, And once my transformation happened and I detransitioned, that whole house of cards blew away in the wind.
So your theory around intersex just dissolved. Like your theory didn't stand up to reality, basically.
Well, yeah, because if it was an intersex condition, that implies that it's more immutable. So if we're looking at nature versus nurture, that
Mm,
I was born with this condition, that maybe I had a male brain, female body, or whatever. Um,
mm.
And so that would imply that it was innate. I was born with it. And if I changed on such a deep level, I'm not sure exactly what that means. And I flip-flopped on that. I think that the condition I had was very deeply rooted in me. I don't think it's a shallow condition that's easily changeable.
Energy level, like it's beyond mental health. It's like not even emotional. It's deeper than that. It's like your energy was like, what is it? Like,
Yeah, I actually had a revelation somewhat recently that I think it does have to do with some kind of energy structure in the body. Like people talk about the chakras,
mhm,
and maybe some people think that's a little new age woo, but like I really believe there's something to this because so like I had a intense spiritual transformation last year, about a year and a half ago in March 2023. And that healed me on a very deep whole body level. That was
mhm.
incredibly powerful, and that, like, affected every cell in my body. For a whole month, I felt like a superhero, like, really powerful, and life was really deep and really vibrant. And it was about 6 to 8 weeks after that when these other changes started to come up in me, and it was like all of a sudden, this, like, something in my nature was coming to the surface and was just happening, and I've always been driven by what's happening to me internally. So, like, before I could even say what changed me or decide to be different, I just was different. And I was just acting and reacting differently. And that's what sparked the detransition. So, on one hand, you could say, well, it probably wasn't some immutable, innate
Mhm.
disorder I was born with, you could still say that it was quite serious and quite deep because the healing that happened to me was equally as deep.
I
And
like
when I was transformed with this spiritual transformation, it felt like there was literally this energy structure in my body that was completely broken down and restructured.
I want to say two things here. One, you said healing, very key. You're recognizing with that word that there was some sort of quote unquote disorder. There was some sort of misalignment from in the face of Jack, or maybe being born with some misalignments. From age 3 to 4, you had some awareness. There's some sort of misalignment or something happening, and you healed from this at age what?
28.
So you took 28 years to heal this energetic. It sounds like on the level of prana, energy, like chakra, like something like that. You were born into the world with this chakra misalignment. I don't know, but maybe we should look at transgenderism through a more subtle lens rather than just a mental health disorder or a I mean, there's probably many layers to it, but in your case it sounded extremely like on a level of karma. You like karmic level. Like deep.
Yeah.
This is developing a new theory around transgenderism, just this conversation.
There's multiple layers to this that I've been grappling with since detransition that are very counterintuitive. So I think most human beings have an instinct for gender. They know what their own body feels like. Their own body's affected by whatever gender they are. And like you kind of live and breathe in this body. And then on top of that, I'm pretty sure most people have an instinct to perceive gender in others. And I think these instincts really drive us a certain direction. And that explains why the topic of transgenderism is so intense, is that people have instincts. So there's people who are against transgenderism that don't believe it's real. Maybe they think it's a mental illness. And sometimes they're like emotionally really intense about it. And I think some of that is driven by instinct that it doesn't seem natural to them, or they're disturbed by it, or they just think this is messing with nature, whatever they think. But I think there's a reason that it gets so emotional for them and even like ego driven.
Oh,
And then simultaneously, I noticed this when I was trans, that transgender people have a set of instincts driving our gender and how we feel. So these instincts are very human. that also relates to what you're saying about prana or energy. It is some kind of an energetic condition or disorder. Well, when I say, it was
What
like
he-
this energy structure in my body was broken down and restructured. It's a very unique feeling because it's like all of the pieces of the puzzle for me to feel whole and complete and healthy were right here in my
yeah,
body. It was already present. It was just everything was mixed up in the wrong way. Tried to pull apart, like, well, what was I actually feeling when I was suffering? What were those feelings physically and emotionally? And when I was transformed, it took me a little while to fully process this, like, and notice it, the subtleties, but I was healed of things I didn't even know I was suffering because I had been experiencing it my entire life.
right,
Where, like, I had this tension and this strain where it affected how my body moved. My balance was really bad. I was very clumsy. I didn't mind being short. I was short for a man. And I got used to it. But even without me knowing it consciously, my body was always straining to go up.
right,
It was always like trying to pull me higher up. So like there was this like tension and like this resistance. Like my body was like the energy in my body or my consciousness was like pulling away from my body. It could not fully sink into it. And when I was healed, all of that dissolved and crumbled away, and I could sink into my body and I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't alienated. Like I used to like feel my body and look at it and be like, I cannot recognize all of this as even human. Something is wrong. And now everything feels human.
feels real, it feels natural. But what caused the healing? Tell me about the healing experience.
March 5th, 2023, by far the most intense spiritual experience I've had in my life. It's not just any one thing, it's like a transformation. My good friend Danielle took me to a movie spontaneously. I didn't know much about this movie. I went in kind of completely blind, honestly. And the movie was called Jesus Revolution, and it was about these 1960s hippies and like this big movement. And it was a branch out of the hippie movement that was like a Christian revival. And in the movie, there's this old dying church that's kind of uptight and old fashioned, and the pastor decides to take in these hippies, very different cultures, and they clash, and all of a sudden just crazy things happen, and it's like this amazing thing. Because I went into it blind, I like the whole thing was unfolding moment to moment, and I was just mind blown each
Huh.
moment. And the the beauty of the film was the vulnerability of their experiences. There was this scene where the pastor is in front of the entrance to the church, and he has a
Mhm.
long line of hippies ready to go in, and they're barefoot and they're a little dirty because they're kind of just vagabonds traveling, and he's washing their feet. And that was like the first moment of the movie I just cried. There was something revelational in this, like, coming together of human beings who are
Yeah,
so different from each other. The pastor is just showing love and courage.
yeah.
And this is beyond words. This is on the road to agape, which is this like spiritual level of love that is beyond our comprehension, that is multidimensional. And I believe that even though I cannot fully understand it, that I have witnessed agape.
Okay.
After
Yeah.
that movie, I was like, it's like the seeing that movie, like, bam, I'm struck by lightning, and it's like I was in a shell, and like my old being had like grown really old and like stagnated and was like turning to stone, and then this shell had solidified, and I was struck by lightning and it cracked the shell, and all of a sudden it's crumbling away. I'm on my way home from the movie, and there's just things being communicated to me somehow, that is about the concept of faith. Throughout our lives, you're invited up to the door of faith, and you can open this door, and it's an invitation to take a leap into the unknown, an invitation to go on a journey, to take a chance. It could be on a new job, it could be on a relationship, or going on some adventure. It any number of things. It's like the universe invites us to these possibilities. And after you open the door of faith, the universe asks you if you want to take a leap, even though you don't know if it's going to go well, if you don't know what's going to happen. And what I was receiving this communication was that if you do not take a leap of faith at all, you have no access to meaning in this world. That was like the big lesson that I needed. And then when I got home, I sat on the floor of my bedroom and closed my eyes. With my eyes closed, I was seeing this like oscillating geometric psychedelic tunnel that was like changing in waves of colors. I was just sucked into it somehow, like inside my own body. Like I
Wow.
went to another dimension and I just completely surrendered to it. And it felt physically like you're bobbing along in the ocean and there's a vulnerability of like this groundlessness. You're not tethered to solid ground. And for a brief moment, I almost felt afraid, but then some kind of energy rushed in and comforted me. As I'm going into this portal, it feels like I'm moving towards some presence that's becoming more and more clear and intense. And it's like all my five senses combined into one sight, touch, all of it became this one thing. And then eventually it felt like I arrived, which was weird because it felt like I was in infinity, but somehow I stopped and I arrived and I felt like I was one with the space. I
Mhm.
also felt like I was before the this grand presence. It's so big, it's so indescribable. It was infinite, it was intimidating, it was loving, it's like it was witnessing everything I experienced in my life. It was witnessing all of my friends' lives. It was witnessing everything. And that was when it slashed me repeatedly with white light. It didn't hurt at all. And this energy structure was broken down and restructured in my body.
Wow.
And then I came out of that, and for a whole month, I felt like a superhero, and life was unbelievably vibrant, experiencing like this connection and this stillness. And I
Mhm.
was sensing the vulnerability in life in all living creatures.
So you sat down on your floor after watching Jesus Revolution, you got sucked into a portal into another dimension where you got to sit in the presence of an infinite being, it sounds like. And then the infinite being slash you with white light and change your energy structure to become healed you of your condition. Which I don't even want to call it transgender now, based on your experience. Dysfunction, I don't know what you want to call it, but I don't even want to call it transgender
Yeah.
anymore. You told me, and this is also, and I'm just going to share this from my own personal experience because wait, this I'm bringing this up because I mentioned this earlier in the podcast. God, your relationship with God. You said God healed my transgender. You told me this. Your relationship with God before this experience and now after this experience. Tell me a bit about that.
God
Yeah.
healed me.
Sandra, I'm so conflicted in saying this, but like we don't know. I love that we're using language that we're just exploring and we're like, man, what is this? It's not transgender. It's some sort of energy disorder. The world sees it as this word called transgender. Just getting into this and we're exploring some pioneering territory in this. Man, I don't even know what to do or say next. But explain, yeah, maybe your relationship around God, or tell me about how the healing happened. I don't know.
It was the moment that the energy structure was broken down and restructured. That I think was the moment of like healing. And leading up to that, as I'm brought into this other realm, I felt like my entire physical being was changing. Like, you can't really be human and go to this dimension. It's almost like I was traveling to the deepest part of my own soul, is how I perceive it. And the deeper you get to your own soul, the closer you get to God. And so,
Mhm.
like, I had to go to this other part of my being. It was the level of depth the healing needed to happen. We could go a little more scientific that I think this parallels healing trauma too. Transgenderism has a lot of moving pieces with it. Okay, so what we do know is that a lot of kids who present as having gender dysphoria grow out of it
Really
throughout their
quick.
childhood. I think what I need to do now to fill in some of the gaps in the conversation is build a picture of what we do know about transgenderism and then some of my ideas on the matter now. Because it's quite complicated and it's very counterintuitive. One of the things that we do know from research is that 80% of kids who have gender dysphoria actually grow out of it throughout their adolescence at some point. So then there's the 20% that don't grow out of it that persist into adulthood and typically they transition. And so I was among that 20%. The typical understanding was, okay, well, then we just need to diagnose properly and we need to give people the amount of time necessary to explore themselves and then get them in therapy and just go through an interdisciplinary process with therapy and all kinds of things. And then we're going to make sure we don't transition the people who don't need it because that could actually be damaging to them. That last 20% really are legitimately transgender innately, and they're going to be, satisfied with it the rest of their lives. Problem is that I was among that 20%. I was pretty hardcore. I was very cut and dry. I was very intense. Like I was very boyish. I relate to men even to this day, like psychologically, personality-wise. Appearance-wise, I don't necessarily look very androgynous. Um, I pretty much look like a woman now. But personality-wise and psychologically, I very much relate to men, and I have a lot of masculine traits. I was one of those kids that was like rock solid transgender and for a very long time, and my transition went extremely well. I was one of the lucky ones, and there was testosterone. I felt like it saved my life at the time it was happening. It got rid of like 80% of my physical pain. My medical transition, as it appeared, it looked like it was treating my health issues. And so for a very long time, I believed that my transgenderism was causing all of these health issues. Now that I detransitioned, I've kind of questioned if what if I got it backwards and that I actually had underlying health issues that
Mm,
caused my transgenderism and that
interesting.
transgenderism was a secondary disorder. There's a social aspect to it. And so if, you face child abuse, if you're alienated, if you are we would call it gender nonconforming. So if I was a girl that was gender nonconforming, I was very masculine. So there's social aspects to it. People find transgenderism as a way to make sense of these social experiences. And then there's physical aspects where you could be abused and you have trauma. You could be traumatized by health issues. So I think I was traumatized by all of those things. I built up this identity that I was a boy and that I had this disorder. And so like what does it mean to have an identity like that? There was things associated with boys versus girls for me that was very particular. Being a girl was something that was forced on me. So that was associated with this prison that I was trapped in and I wanted to be liberated from it. And so I
Yeah.
never really got to experience being a girl in a way that was natural, that wasn't forced on me. Parents and adults around me hadn't forced things on me. That would have been one less thing complicating matters. If you're trying to force things on kids, like force them to not be transgender, I think it's likely you're going to make it a lot worse and they'll just be more transgender as a result.
At least you're speaking from experience. Like, hey, if your kid's saying, I'm a boy, I'm a boy, I'm a boy, and she's a girl, or vice versa, whatever, and you just fight that really hard, you're just going to make it worse. I think that lines up with your experience, and I'd say lines up with my experience too. Not that I've had any gender dysphoria myself or anyone around me, but I acknowledge that as
Yeah.
something to consider as parents. And I'm a parent. I have three kids, so I have to consider that as well.
Something else I realized if we're talking about identity, what were the things, what were the features of my identity as a boy? What does that even mean if there was this identity that developed and versus like being a girl? So I learned some psychology terms from Dr. K. He runs the YouTube channel Healthy Gamer. And he was trained as a monk for 7 years in India, and now he's a psychiatrist. So he combines East and West together and it's just incredible stuff. And he described in one of his videos a psychological experience called ego syntonic or ego dystonic. If something is ego syntonic, it means that you perceive it as in alignment with yourself. Alignment usually is a spiritual term, like this means something deeper beyond ego, but so ego syntonic really means that like you naturally perceive it as being a part of you, that it's not outside of you, it's not against you. Ego dystonic would be you're having an experience, you feel like you're subjected to it, and it's not really a part of you. My
Yeah.
experience of being a boy as a kid was ego syntonic, and being a girl was something forced upon me that was ego dystonic. Every time my mom would reject these aspects of me, I would fight against it. And this was a part of my authenticity.
Yeah.
Whatever she was rejecting became a collection of traits that were all associated together. And I had to defend these traits, and this became associated with my authenticity. So being a boy became associated with me wanting to liberate myself and be authentic.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. It's part of your hero's journey, like you said, and autonomy and all these. We have covered a lot of really phenomenal terms, big words, dystonic ego. Is there anything else that you'd want it that you're burning to share? Like, hey, there's like your inner voice is saying, or God is saying, hey, let's share something else.
I just want people to consider that we don't understand transgenderism very well
Mm-hmm.
and encourage people to be open to exploring that, and not be too attached to any one narrative. I'm really on the path to promote healing and
Yeah.
spirituality. And I want, people to not be afraid to explore that. There may be transgender people that could hear this and they could be afraid to explore the kind of healing that I went through because it changes you and then you detransition. Um, I can't say what anyone else's journey is going to be, but I want to encourage you to explore your own healing in your own unique way, and really emphasize exercise, healing physically, physical practices, because these are very spiritual things, and they were extremely helpful for me on my journey.
Hmm. Hmm. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. Promoting healing. We don't understand transgender. I agree with you. Amazing. What did we just say today? What did we get through today? That was something I didn't expect. I'm excited for this to share this with people. If I'm transgender or I'm thinking about detransitioning or whatever, I'm lost in the path and I want support, where do I go?
I started a support group on Discord for trans and detrans people. You can include a link to that on the podcast.
Yeah.
And yeah, we are really focused on health. It's non-judgmental. So we're not going to tell people what they should do in their situation of like, you're not trans, or there's no debates really. It's not a debate environment. It's not politicized. It's really supposed to be open and accepting to help people. Really, we're helping each other. We're all exploring.
Yeah.
And we all may have health issues related to medical transition or detransition. And so we're trying to help each other through these things to find the care that we need and figure out what makes you feel more at peace in your body. That's the ultimate goal.
I personally experience yoga to be a phenomenal tool to experience more peace in my body, in my mind, my soul. Isha yoga in particular, like I've promoted. Just Discord's the main thing, or is there any other resources you'd give them?
There's a couple of D-trans groups on Reddit, and that's really that's the only places I've found people talking about detransition. Um, I can send you some links for actually some organizations that really help. There's an organization called GenSpect, and an organization called Beyond Trans, and they offer support groups for people that are possibly detransitioning or just dealing with medical complications with transgenderism. There's people that will reject me just because I detransitioned. They don't really want to talk to detransitioners. I think there's fear around that because, I experienced this when I was trans, is that there is a desire to have it recognized as a legitimate condition, and therefore my identity as a man is legitimate and real. Yeah, so there's different groups politically that are sensitive,
Mhm.
and you can't please all of them. That'd be impossible. So like, because people are very tribalistic on this topic. And it is controversial for me to say that I was healed from transgenderism. It's even
Yeah.
more controversial for me to say God healed me because that sounds like conversion therapy to people in LGBT culture.
Yeah.
So it's like I'm not anti-trans. I didn't suddenly become against a condition I experienced my entire life. Like, I have much more experience socially living as a man, passing very well as a man. Most people didn't even know I was trans. Like, I have lots of experience with that, and I'm not anti-trans just because this happened to me. It's just that, like you were saying, we're pioneering. We're trying to understand what this experience is, and then I just want people to realize that you can pursue healing trauma, and healing physically in your body and feeling more at peace without it being a threat to your identity necessarily. That, I don't have any requirements for people to be transgender or detransition in my group and like, but my idea is that outside of that, whether you stay trans or not, I believe there is a deeper level of healing, and people can decide for themselves what they want to do thereafter.
I love that you just said that so much. You said you can heal your body and your mind without being identified around the gender thing. You don't have to be so identified with your body or your gender identity. Like, oh, I am a man, I'm a woman. Like, no, like you can still heal your trauma, heal your stuff, and not be like so caught up in your gender, your identity. So thank you, Maisie, so much. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart to show up here and share your story, which is something everyone needs to hear. You are a conduit for something really amazing um, in this narrative of LGBTQ. If you want to find Maisie and her work, you can go to her Discord page and look at the links there. I'll also include some other links for Maisie in this episode. You can find out more about her and what she's doing on her work in this community. So thank you so much again. Have a blessed day, and we will see you next time.
Bye.